So a few years ago, someone actually gave me a lapel microphone, and it wasn't compatible with my iPad, which is what I use to film all these videos. But I recently got an iPhone, and I think it will work with that. So I'm going to try using that for the intro to improve the sound quality of the intro, and hopefully it's a little bit easier to hear that, and it cuts down on some of the background noise, cars going by my shop and whatnot. So with that said, the last part of this series is going to be mostly the finish I put on the table. One of my finishes of choice, especially for utilitarian surfaces that see high use, water spills, even standing water, is going to be water locks. If you watch the walnut table build, you know that I really like oil finishes, and this actually has tung oil in it. For a finish, I consider it extremely DIY friendly. The finish itself produces, I think, a nicer look to it than something like polyurethane or even lacquer. So it's kind of a plus all around. It's a little more expensive than those. In fact, it's probably about twice as much expensive as polyurethane, and it's harder to find. It's harder to find because they don't have it in some of the big box stores. So there is that to consider. But I'll show you the process of how I get this on there and how I finish it up. And it comes in the original water locks is kind of a gloss finish, and then it dulls down over time, but they also sell a satin finish, and that's what this is. So I'll show you how I did it. So I'm starting this off by actually showing you the back side of the piece, and this is similar to what I'm going to do to the front, but I stained it. I originally thought the customer wanted it a little bit darker than I thought, so the backside has stain on it. I kept it in the video because if you don't like the natural look of oak, you can do this process and stain it, and it can turn out the color that you like. But basically what I'm doing for this is I have a handheld power planer. You can do this with a belt sander, would take a little bit longer. A hand planer would take about the same amount of time. I have the power planer. These aren't super expensive, so that's what I used. I have it set to an extremely low setting. It's not even taking off a 1/16 of an inch. And I'm going through and riding the high spots and removing some of that material to not only flatten out the surface, but to get rid of some of the grittiness of the tabletop. She obviously didn't want that rough sawn surface across the whole piece. She wanted about 25% of it. So that's what I did. You could see I left it pretty blotchy. That power planer went through and removed a ton of material, but as you can see, it flattened out most of the surface. There's still some peaks and valleys, but as I said in the last video, I had already discussed that with the customer, and they were okay with it. If you flatten out this whole surface, it will look like natural red oak, which is obviously not what she wanted. So you kind of see after planing it, after sanding it is when it starts to look really nice. It cuts down the rest of that rough material, but like I said, still keeps a little bit of that sawn look that you get from milling lumber and then letting it dry. So I did the exact same thing minus the power planer for the legs. The four corner legs were already pretty good, so I just went through with a belt sander and just roughly sanded all of those pieces. To finish up the table before I finish it up, I'm adding some 45s in the corner. With tables in general, especially these with those really big legs, 45s are one of those amazing things you could do with woodworking that automatically will sure up a joint. It just makes it super strong. Now this wasn't necessarily wobbly or anything like that, but this will just ensure over time, especially with those big chunky legs, that everything will stay where it should. So I just rough cut some 45s on my table saw. I used scrap material from the build, and you can see I'm just going to screw them into the aprons. The table was sturdy before, now it's extremely sturdy. None of these legs or the aprons move at all. I did that obviously on all four corners. Then to attach the top, I'm using these figure eights just because it's an easy method. So you just countersink a 3/4 inch hole. You move a little bit of the material until those figure eights can move, so that when the tabletop moves, the figure eights move with it. And then I could finally dry assemble this. So this finish is a tung oil and a modified resin, so you get the best of both worlds. The tung oil penetrates the surface, while the resin is water resistant and also elastic, so it moves with the lumber a little bit better than other finishes. So this is the finish I was talking about, water locks. If you want the satin finish, what you do is you actually put on multiple coats of the original and then you finish it up with the satin, which is nice because the satin's a little more expensive. It tells you on there that it starts at a 70% gloss and then it lowers to about a 50% gloss, and the satin will be about a 20 to 25% gloss. So in order to do this process, I needed both products. They sell this at Woodcraft. I live somewhat near a Woodcraft. You could get it on Amazon, but it would have taken a little bit longer to ship. So I'm putting on the first coat. You put this stuff on very liberally, and I'm using an abrasive green pad to put it on. This will somewhat sand the surface as I'm going. So instead of using just a cloth pad, I'm using one of those green 3M pads in order to apply the finish. Doing the same thing for the top. And especially the first coat, you can really put a lot on there. Doing the exact same thing for the legs with that green pad and putting the finish on there. Now the one huge downside to water locks, and there's a lot of finishes like this, poly's not as bad. You have to wait a full 24 hours before you can put a second coat on. They say you only have to put 3 coats on hardwood and 4 coats on softwood, but I put at least 5 on this. I'm pretty sure I put 5 on this. It might have been 6. Just to get a nice build on there. So that takes at least a week just to apply the finish. In between coats, especially the first coat, because I didn't sand this down to a super fine finish, I took some 220 grit sandpaper and then just lightly went over the whole surface. The grain is going to be raised a little bit after you put on a coat of finish, and instead of pre-raising the grain and sanding, I just put on the first coat and then sand, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And then it's the exact same process putting on another coat. You can see I've switched to a white pad, so this is not nearly as abrasive, but it's still a sanding pad. So I'm pretty much wet sanding the finish onto the tabletop as I go, as well as the table legs. This is a process I used on the walnut table as well. I really liked it. I don't really think there's much I would do to change that process at this point versus using just a rag. It creates an extremely smooth surface without even wet sanding it at the end. I really like how it applies and the finish it leaves. So this is about second coat. I don't show all the coats, but it's the same process. So now I switched over to a palm sander because I have finer grit sandpaper for a palm sander. I believe I'm up to 400. Very lightly sanding the surface. I'm not going through and removing a ton of material. And then I'm going to put on another coat of the water locks. So instead of what they recommended, I believe for hardwood, which this is obviously because it's oak, would be 2 coats of the original and then 1 coat of satin. What I ended up doing was 4 coats of the original till it got to be the finish I wanted, and then 1 coat of the satin. So you finish up with the satin. And that is what it looks like. And it's really, the sheen's really starting to pop. And then same process, this is 400 grit again, just going through. At this point, you're really not sanding that much at all. The surface is starting to build up, and there's not a lot of rough patches. Since it's a tabletop, people are going to be putting their hands on it and touching it, so you really want to put some care into, especially the tabletop being nice and smooth. The legs I don't kill myself over as much because you're not really rubbing against the legs of the table. And then you could see from the video that was the 4th coat, and it went through an entire quart of the finish. So for a table this size, with the amount of coats I put on, you could see it went through about a quart. And then this is putting the satin on. So after the last coat of the gloss, I didn't show it, but I lightly sanded again. And then I put on the satins. The satin was only 1 coat, so I let that dry for about a week to fully cure. You'll know if it's fully cured if you go to sand it and it starts gumming up on your pad. That means it's not ready yet. So then I'm going to wet sand this, which is basically just some water and some soap, and this is really going to smooth out the surface. This is 1200 grit sandpaper. The first time I tried this, I was a little bit skeptical, I'm not going to lie, but I love the way that this smooths out the surface, this wet sanding process. You can get really into it and spend a lot of time smoothing out the surface, but since this is a rustic piece of furniture, I did it very lightly and I was happy with the results. A higher grit sandpaper will give you a glossier surface, and a lower grit sandpaper will give you more of a matte surface. So this is 1200 grit, and I might actually take this down to 1000. There were still somewhat shiny spots showing through, but that is the final finish. I love the way the waterlocks looks. There's really no blemishes on this at all. I didn't wet sand the legs because it, like I said, it didn't need it. So I just wet sanded the top, and this is pretty much the finished product.